Cascade Foothills, Washington, October 1889. The air, sharp with the promise of a bitter winter, carried the scent of pine resin and wet stone. Along the roaring churn of Sulphur Creek, a man was building something that made no sense. While other settlers raised their cabins on cleared, dry ground, Lawrence Summermatter was building his in the damp, shadowed throat of a granite alcove, directly behind the 20-foot cascade that gave the creek its name. The work was slow and strange. He wasn't felling the giant firs for his walls. He was hauling river stones, wrestling them into place against the weeping granite face of the cliff. His front wall, the only one that would face the valley, was of carefully notched cedar, but the other three sides were the living rock of the mountain itself. Burl Oaks, the land claims agent for the territorial government, stood on the opposite bank, his ledger tucked under his arm, a look of profound disbelief on his face. He was a man who understood regulations, floodplains, and the unforgiving logic of frontier survival. What he was witnessing violated all three. "Summermatter!" he yelled over the roar of the falls. "That's a seasonal waterway. I'll have to file this site as an unacceptable flood risk. You're building your family a tomb." A few other settlers, Silas Croft and Jedediah Stone among them, had stopped their work to watch the Swiss man's folly. "It's damp madness," Croft muttered to Stone, loud enough to carry. "The damp will get into his children's lungs before the first snow. He's a fool." Lawrence paused, setting a heavy stone into a bed of lime mortar. He looked across the water at the men, his face calm, betraying no offense. He wiped his hands on his trousers and called back in his thick, quiet accent, "The water is my friend, Mr. Oaks." Then he turned back to his work, leaving the claims agent and the settlers to shake their heads at the sheer, inexplicable foolishness of the newcomer. They saw a man building a house in the wettest, coldest, most dangerous spot in the entire valley, a place destined to become a coffin of ice. What did this Swiss millwright understand about the latent heat of flowing water that a seasoned claims agent and a valley of hardened settlers had missed? This channel is dedicated to the lost wisdom of the past, to the innovators who solved impossible problems with the materials at hand. Their stories are not just history, they are lessons in physics, resilience, and the quiet power of observation. If you believe that ingenuity is timeless, subscribe to our channel and join a community that honors these forgotten pioneers. I promise by the end of this story you will understand a fundamental principle of thermodynamics that can keep a home warm with almost no fire. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional building you've ever seen? Lawrence Summermatter was not a farmer. He was not a logger, a trapper, or a carpenter in the way the American frontiersman understood the term. In his native Valais canton of Switzerland, he had been a Mühlenbauer, a millwright. But this title failed to capture the entirety of his trade. He was a master of stone, water, and pressure. His hands knew the heft of granite blocks, the precise curve of a water wheel's bucket, the unyielding strength of a bedrock foundation. For 2 decades, his work had been to harness the violent energy of alpine cascades, channeling their power through flumes and gears to grind rye and wheat into flour. His mills were not wooden shacks built near a river. They were stone fortresses built into the river, pressed against the granite cliffs from which the water fell. He had learned that the stone of the mountain was a far better wall than any tree, and that the water, even in the depths of an alpine winter, held a secret warmth. He had come to America with his wife Annalise and their 2 small children, Mateo and Elsbeth, seeking land and a future. But their first winter in the Washington Cascades had been a brutal education. They lived in a hastily built board and batten shack, a temporary shelter that proved to be little more than a sieve for the cold. Lorenz, for all his skill with stone, had never built a home purely of wood, and he was appalled by its thermal incompetence. The green timber shrank as it dried, opening up 100 tiny cracks for the wind to knife through. That winter was a lesson in misery taught by the laws of thermodynamics. The temperature inside their shack swung a horrifying 35 degrees from midday to the pre-dawn hours. Annalise would cook a pot of stew for dinner, and by morning, a thin film of ice would have formed on any leftovers. The children, Matteo and Elsbeth, slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned. The cruelest detail was the hinges on the door. Every morning they wept beads of ice, condensation from the family's breath freezing solid on the cold iron. It was a constant, visible reminder of how much heat they were losing, how close the killing cold truly was. They burned through their winter wood supply by the end of January, and Lorenz spent the bitter days of February trudging through deep snow to fell and buck whatever deadfall he could find, a desperate daily battle against the cold. He swore he would never let his family suffer like that again. He had not survived the Swiss Alps to be broken by a Washington winter. The problem wasn't the American log cabin itself. In the forests of the East, where winters were cold but timber was plentiful and well understood, it was a sound design. But here, in the Cascade foothills, the conventional wisdom failed. The settlers built as they knew how, with single walls of massive fir or cedar logs, chinked with moss and mud. They believed, with the confidence of generations, that a thick wall was a warm wall. They were wrong. The primary failure was a misunderstanding of heat transfer. A solid log, no matter how thick, is a powerful conductor of heat. The immense cold of the outside air would simply seep through the wood over a period of hours, leaching warmth from the interior. The settlers fought this constant loss with bigger fires. Their cast iron stoves glowed red-hot day and night, consuming enormous quantities of wood. They were engaged in a brute force battle, attempting to pour BTUS into a leaky container faster than the cold could drain them out. It was a battle they were guaranteed to lose. Silas Croft's cabin was a perfect example of this conventional failure. He had built it with pride, using logs nearly 2 feet in diameter. "No wind will move this house," he'd boasted. He was right about the wind, but wrong about the cold. In the depths of winter, the interior face of his north-facing wall was so cold that a bucket of water placed near it would freeze overnight, even with a fire roaring in the stove just 15 feet away. The cold didn't break the wall down. It simply moved through it. An invisible, unstoppable tide. The second failure was air infiltration. Green wood shrinks. The carefully packed mud and moss chinking would dry, crumble, and fall out, creating dozens of tiny gaps. On a windy night, a family could feel the drafts on the backs of their necks. They would stuff rags, old clothes, anything they could find into the cracks, but it was a losing effort. Each tiny jet of frigid air was like an open vein, bleeding the precious warmth of the cabin out into the wilderness. The flickering of a candle flame in a drafty cabin wasn't a sign of cozy ambiance. It was a diagnostic tool showing exactly where the heat was escaping. The result was a life dictated by the stove. The zone of survivability in a typical valley cabin was a small circle, perhaps 10 feet in diameter, around the cast iron beast. Beyond that circle, the temperature plummeted. Families lived their entire winter lives in that small radius, cooking, eating, mending clothes, sleeping on pallets on the floor as close to the fire as they dared. It was a life of constant toil, feeding the fire, and constant, gnawing cold. The settlers accepted this as the price of life on the frontier. Lawrence Summermatter, having seen the alternative, knew it was the price of poor design. Lawrence began his work in late August, when the creek was at its lowest. The alcove he had chosen was a natural feature, a half-dome of granite carved out over millennia by the Waterfall's spray. The floor was a jumble of fallen rock and gravel, which he cleared by hand, levering out boulders with a stout iron bar and shoveling the rest into the creek to be washed away. He was not clearing land, he was excavating a foundation down to the bedrock. His neighbors watched with a mixture of pity and scorn. "He's digging his own cellar," Jedediah Stone remarked to a group of men at the small trading post. "He'll have 3 feet of water in it by Christmas." Lawrence ignored them. He understood water in a way they did not. He located the high water marks from the spring melt, faint lines of debris and discoloration on the granite walls, and designed his foundation to sit a full 2 feet above the highest recorded level. He spent a week building a small cofferdam of logs and packed clay to divert the main flow of the creek, allowing him to work on a dry base. Then came the stone. For weeks, he and Annalise worked together, hauling smooth, rounded stones from the creek bed. He was not building a crude rock wall. He was fitting the stones together with the precision of a master mason. Using a lime mortar, he made himself from limestone harvested downriver and burned in a makeshift kiln. The back and side walls of his cabin were the granite alcove itself. He simply sealed the stone floor to the living rock with a thick, waterproof barrier of his mortar, creating a shallow, impermeable basin. It was during this phase that Burl Oakes made his official visit. The claims agent was not a malicious man, but he was a man of the book. He saw a structure being erected within the defined banks of a creek, a clear violation of territorial settlement codes. "Summer matter," Oakes said, standing on the edge of the work site, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. "I've warned you. My report will have to state that this claim is non-compliant. The structure is situated in a seasonal flood zone. The territory will not grant you a patent on this land." He pointed a stern finger at the waterfall. "That water is your enemy. It represents an economic threat to the viability of your claim." Lawrence set a particularly large capstone in place, tapping it gently with his hammer until it settled perfectly. He looked at Oakes, his eyes calm. "In my country, we build with the mountain, not on it," he said. "The water is not the threat. The wind is the threat. Here, there is no wind." He gestured to the protected space of the alcove where the air was still, and the roar of the falls was a constant deep hum. Oakes just shook his head. He made a series of notes in his ledger, his pencil scratching with an air of finality. He saw only risk and foolishness. He could not see the elegant physics at play. The front wall was the last piece. It was made of cedar logs, carefully scribed and fitted to the uneven contours of the granite opening. Lawrence insulated it in a way no one in the valley had ever seen. He built 2 parallel walls of smaller logs, leaving a 6-inch gap between them, which he painstakingly filled with dried moss and sawdust from his cutting. It was a tremendous amount of extra work, but Lorenz knew the secret was not thick walls, but trapped air. Air was the greatest insulator on Earth, if you could only keep it still. By the time the first snows fell in November, the cabin was complete. It looked bizarre, like a small, traditional log cabin that had been pushed backwards into a cave. The roof, made of split cedar shakes, sloped steeply from the rock face down to the top of the front wall, leaving no place for snow to accumulate. A thin plume of smoke rose from a stone chimney built against the side of the alcove. To the settlers in the valley, it was a strange, damp, and doomed little house. To Lawrence Summermatter, it was a machine for surviving the winter. To understand why Lawrence's strange cabin worked, you have to understand a hidden property of water. Most people think of temperature as a smooth, linear scale. As you remove heat from water, it gets colder and colder until it hits 32 degrees Fahrenheit and becomes ice. This is true, but it omits the most important part of the story. The transition from liquid to solid is not a gentle slope. It is a cliff. At the precise moment that 1 pound of water at 32 degrees decides to become 1 pound of ice at 32 degrees, it must release a tremendous amount of energy. This energy is called the latent heat of fusion. For water, the number is specific and powerful: 144 British thermal units, or BTUs, per pound. A single BTU is the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. So, to turn into ice, a pound of water has to shed the same amount of energy it would take to raise its temperature from 32 degrees all the way to 176 degrees. It is a massive energetic sacrifice. A still pond on a cold night gives up this heat easily. The surface cools, the molecules slow down, and the latent heat radiates away into the cold air, allowing ice to form. But Lauren's Summer Matters cabin was not next to a pond. It was behind a waterfall. Flowing water is water in motion. The constant turbulence, the swirling and mixing, prevents the water molecules from arranging themselves into the neat crystalline structure of ice. For the waterfall to freeze, the entire flow of the creek would have to be chilled below 32 degrees. As the Arctic air of a Cascade winter tried to pull heat from the water fought back. Every drop that flirted with freezing would release its 144 BTUs of latent heat, which would be immediately mixed back into the flow, warming its neighbors. The waterfall was, in effect, a massive thermal engine. The creek, fed by the immense thermal mass of the earth upstream, was a constant source of water at a temperature safely above freezing, likely around 38 to 40 degrees. As this water tumbled over the falls, the spray and aeration exposed a massive surface area to the cold air. The air would steal its heat, trying to force it to freeze. But the water would not freeze. Instead, it would release its latent heat, a gentle, constant furnace that needed no wood. The air in the alcove behind the falls became trapped in this thermal exchange. It could never get much colder than the water itself. The constant release of latent heat from the churning water at the base of the falls guaranteed that the air temperature within that protected pocket would hover at or above 34 degrees Fahrenheit, even if the ambient temperature 100 feet away was 10 below zero. The final piece of Lorenz's design was the granite wall of the alcove. Over the course of the day, the immense stone mass would absorb this gentle, constant heat from the water and the trapped air. It became a thermal battery. At night, as the outside temperatures plummeted, the granite would slowly radiate this stored warmth back into the cabin, stabilizing the interior temperature. Lorenz hadn't just built a cabin behind a waterfall. He had docked his home against a natural, self-regulating furnace and a mountain-sized radiator. The winter arrived not as a gentle slide, but as an Arctic hammer blow. In the second week of December, a high-pressure system settled over the region, pulling a relentless flow of frigid air from the east out of the frozen interior of the continent. The temperatures dropped and stayed down. For 27 consecutive days, the thermometer in the valley never rose above freezing, and for most of that time it hovered near zero. The low point was a soul-crushing -6 degrees Fahrenheit, accompanied by a dry, relentless wind that scoured every last BTU of warmth from the landscape. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a nightmare. The Battle of the Stove became a full-scale war. Silas Croft's 2-foot-thick log walls were bleeding heat so fast that his family was burning through nearly a quarter of a cord of wood every 2 days. The woodpile he thought would last until March was half gone by New Year's Day. His children were sick with hacking coughs, and his wife's face was a permanent mask of exhaustion and worry. One morning he found their milk cow frozen solid in the barn, standing up as if she had simply given up in the night. In Jedediah Stone's cabin, the water barrel in the corner of the main room, a full 10 feet from the stove, froze solid. They had to chip ice out with an axe to get water for coffee. The misery was palpable. The world shrank to the small, smoky space around the fire, a tiny island of warmth in an ocean of lethal cold. In the alcove behind the falls, life was different. The roar of the cascade was a constant presence, a deep hum that vibrated through the stone floor. But inside, the air was still and remarkably mild, with only a small, smoldering fire in their stone hearth, more for cooking and a bit of cheer than for primary heat. The temperature inside the summer matter cabin never dropped below 50 degrees. This is where the contrast between the two realities became stark and absolute. The numerical difference was staggering, -6 degrees outside Burl Oakes's office and a comfortable 52 degrees inside Lorenz's home. But the true difference was visible in the small details of domestic life. In Silas Croft's cabin, a loaf of bread left on the table overnight would be frozen hard as a rock by morning. In Lawrence Summermatter's cabin, Annalise kept a small crock of sourdough starter on a wooden shelf against the back granite wall. It was the same starter she had carried all the way from Switzerland. Throughout the entire 27-day freeze, the starter remained alive, bubbling slowly, fragrant and active. In a world where water, milk, and even livestock were freezing solid, this small pot of living yeast was a profound testament to the success of Lorenz's design. Life, in its most delicate form, could persist here. Annalise could bake fresh bread for her children, while her neighbors were burning their furniture for warmth. On the 20th day of the freeze, on the 20th day, Burl Oakes saddled his horse. He was required by his territorial duties to survey a boundary dispute on a claim upriver from the Summermatter place, and the law did not wait for the weather. He dressed in 3 layers of wool, a heavy buffalo coat, and felt-lined boots. The ink in his pen was frozen, so he carried his ledger and a small corked bottle of ink inside his coat, hoping his body heat would keep it liquid long enough to make his notes. The ride was brutal. The east wind was a physical force, finding every small gap in his clothing. His mustache and beard were quickly coated in a thick layer of frost from his own breath. As he passed the cluster of cabins in the main valley, he saw no signs of life, only the desperate plumes of smoke pouring from every chimney, instantly whipped away by the wind. His route took him past Lawrence Summermatter's claim. He had a legal obligation to check on the site, as his pending unacceptable risk report required a follow-up observation. He rode with a sense of grim duty, expecting to find the waterfall frozen into a monstrous curtain of ice, and the small cabin behind it either abandoned or entombed. What he saw stopped him cold. From a distance, the cascade looked impossibly, miraculously alive. While every other trickle and seep on the surrounding cliffs was a solid sculpture of blue-white ice, the main sheet of Sulphur Creek Falls was still moving, a dark, churning torrent against the frozen landscape. He urged his horse closer, his breath clouding in the vicious air. He could see the cabin's front wall now. There was no frost on the cedar logs, none. Every other structure in the county, every tree, every rock, was coated in a thick, crystalline layer of rime. But the front of Lorenz's cabin was bare, dark, and looked almost warm. Dismounting, Oakes walked cautiously toward the falls. The sound was immense, a roar of life in a dead, silent world. As he stepped into the protected zone of the alcove, the wind ceased. It was as if he had walked through a door into another room. The air was still, more than still. It was measurably warmer. Not warm, but not the biting, painful cold of the open valley. He held up a gloved hand and could feel the difference on the tiny exposed patch of his wrist between glove and coat sleeve. He reached the front door and knocked. It was opened by Lawrence, who was in his shirt sleeves. Oakes stood there, a frozen giant on the doorstep, staring into a scene of impossible normalcy. The vindication was not a shout. It was a wave of mild, humid air that washed over his frozen face. He had expected to be hit by the familiar, miserable cold of a frontier cabin interior. Instead, he smelled baking bread and damp earth, and heard the sound of a child humming. He looked past Lawrence and saw Annalise kneading dough on a flour-dusted table. The two children were on the floor, playing with small wooden animals. The scene was so profoundly normal, so utterly at odds with the Arctic hell outside, that it broke something in Oakes's rigid, regulation-bound mind. "Summer matter," Oakes said, his voice hoarse. The ink in my saddlebag is a solid block. I need to amend a filing." Lauren simply nodded and stepped aside. "Come in, Mr. Oakes. Be welcome." Oakes stepped inside. The warmth was gentle, pervasive. He saw the small, slow fire in the hearth. It couldn't possibly be producing this much heat. Then his eyes fell on a small table near the back wall, where Lawrence had been writing a letter. On the table was a ceramic inkwell. The ink inside was perfectly, impossibly liquid. This small, mundane detail was the final, irrefutable proof. It was a single quiet fact that dismantled everything he thought he knew about winter survival. He didn't apologize for his skepticism or retract his official threats. Frontiersmen didn't operate that way. Instead, he unbuttoned his coat and accepted a mug of hot chicory coffee from Annalise. As he sat there, feeling the life return to his frozen fingers, he looked at the stone wall behind the hearth, which was radiating a gentle, steady warmth. He looked at the impossible, unfrozen ink. "You didn't build a cabin, Summer Matter," Oakes said, his voice quiet with a new kind of respect. "You built a riverbank." He stayed for half an hour, then rode back to his office. The negative report was never filed. News on the frontier traveled not through newspapers but through action and verified results. The story of Lawrence Summer Matter's warm winter spread, not because Lawrence boasted, but because Burl Oakes stopped talking about the foolish Swiss and his flood risk cabin. When asked, the claims agent would just take a long sip of his coffee and say, "Summer Matter understands the creek." From a man like Oakes, this was the highest possible praise, and it carried more weight than 1,000 boasts. The true validation, the mechanism for the idea's spread, came the following summer. A territorial surveyor named Elias Vance was working his way up the valley, officially mapping claim boundaries for the government patents. Vance was a methodical man, a student of geology and hydrology. He had heard the whispers about the Waterfall cabin and made it a point to visit. He arrived on a hot August day and found Lorenz reinforcing the mortar on his foundation. Vance introduced himself and, with professional curiosity, asked if he could take some readings. Lorenz, a man who shared knowledge as freely as he breathed, agreed. Vance spent 2 hours at the site. He measured the dimensions of the alcove, the flow rate of the creek, and the temperature of the water. He used a sensitive thermometer to record the temperature of the granite wall deep inside the cabin, comparing it to exposed rock faces outside. His notes from that day became a small, quiet legend in the Territorial Land Office. In 3 subsequent land filings for parcels downstream from Lawrence's claim, a peculiar annotation appeared, written in Vance's precise script. Claim includes south-facing granite alcove adjacent to perennial cascade. Note, site benefits from significant thermal moderation due to latent heat release from aerated water. Surveyor's observation indicates potential for alcove microclimate to remain approximately 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient winter norms, mitigating frost and wind exposure. The knowledge was no longer folklore. It was data, entered into the official record. Other settlers, reading these surveyors' notes when filing their own claims, began to see the landscape differently. They started looking for sheltered coves, for small, steady creeks that ran all winter. A handful of cabins built in the following years incorporated elements of Lorenz's design: a back wall against a rock face, a deeper foundation, a double-walled construction. The idea began to spread, not as a perfect copy, but as a principle. Work with the landscape. Don't just fight it. The principles that kept Lawrence Summer Matter's family warm in 1889 are more relevant today than ever. He was practicing a form of passive geothermal and microclimate-based architecture a century before those terms became fashionable. Modern architects and engineers use the stable temperature of the Earth, geothermal energy, to heat and cool buildings with incredible efficiency. They use advanced software to model how sunlight, wind, and landscape features interact with a structure. Lorenz Sommermatter had no software. He had observation, memory, and a deep, intuitive understanding of physics, gained from a lifetime of working with stone and water. His waterfall cabin was a brilliant living example of using a natural, ever-present energy flow to create a stable, comfortable human habitat. The settlers in the valley saw the winter as an enemy to be defeated with fire. They saw the forest as a stockpile of fuel for their war. The more brutal the winter, the more wood they threw on the fire, the harder they fought. Lorenz Sommermatter, the quiet millwright from Switzerland, understood that you could not defeat the winter. It was too vast, too powerful. The only way to survive was to find the one small part of the landscape that had already won the battle. He saw the roaring cascade not as a threat of flood or damp, but as a promise. He recognized that water that will not freeze is a furnace that needs no wood. It is a source of constant, gentle energy that asks for nothing in return. He didn't build a shelter to hide from the winter. He built his home inside the winter's one magnificent exception. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and resilience valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more explorations of forgotten wisdom. Every subscription helps us to research and share these incredible stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What modern technologies do you think are anticipated by old techniques like this one? Disclaimer: the content presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters' names and specific events depicted are fictionalized reconstructions inspired by historical building practices and frontier life. The physical and engineering principles discussed are based on real science. However, any application of historical techniques to modern construction should be undertaken with caution and in full compliance with current building codes, safety standards, and engineering regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.